I'm really flattered to be here, and thanks to everybody who's come up to me to just say hello and you know, for reading my blog over the years. I'm really flattered by that. Please, afterwards, if you find me, I'd love to talk to you as well. So I spent a lot of time on this one slide, so I thought maybe we'd just spend some time admiring my typography. Is that okay? So this is the Adobe logo. My title at Adobe is Principal Designer, and that's a kind of a unique role where I spend a lot of time at conferences like this. I spend time with our customers. I talk to people out in the industry, really trying to get a sense of what's going on, and I try to bring those ideas, what I'm hearing, back to Adobe, and that informs the roadmap of the projects that we work on. The product that I focus the most on is Adobe Xd, and Xd is our brand new all-in-one UX UI design tool. So if you make apps, websites, screen experiences of all kinds, this is a really powerful new way of working. We're really proud of it. We actually just debuted the 1.0 version at our annual Max conference in Las Vegas a few weeks ago. So this is what Xd looks like. It's really fast, it's really performant. I'm not going to spend too much time talking about Xd today, but we have a booth outside if you want to take a look at it and spend time with it. What I came here to talk about is careers, how to build a career in design, how to build a sustainable career in design. But I'm actually going to use this topic as a launching point to talk about writing about design. So some people know that I have been writing my blog about design for a really good number of years now, since the early 2000s, which is kind of crazy to think about that I've been doing it for that long. This is a place where I write about design and technology and just things that pique my interest. And it comes from really a passion for writing and wanting to have a venue where I can get my ideas out there, and doing this writing has really helped me open a lot of doors in my career and has helped me really fine-tune the way I think about design, the way I think about the world. It's been a really, really amazing experience to have this. And that writing eventually led me to want to write a book. And this is the first book I wrote in 2010, Ordering Disorder: Grid Principles for Web Design. And this book was about taking what I had learned from the world of print design, because I trained as a print designer, and trying to translate it to the web, to interactive media, in a really native way, a really natural way for technology. And what I learned about writing this book is that, writing a book is really hard, and I think we often underestimate how much work goes into books. And it was a really difficult experience for me, not a particularly fun experience. But particularly writing a book about design that's also genuinely interesting, genuinely compelling, that's really hard as well, because design tends to be very narrowly focused. It tends to be very sort of technically oriented or speak in a language that's not welcoming. And I've really come to believe that if you're writing about design, your ultimate goal should be to expand the audience of people who understand the work that you do, so that more folks can really participate in the world of design. So I went back and took another crack at writing another book a few years ago. This is a book about careers in design. And for this book, I interviewed 14 designers who some of whom I knew personally, some of whom I knew by reputation. And I interviewed folks from studios, from agencies, from startups, to big tech companies. And The previous book I had written was kind of a very technical book and required a lot of research and a lot of planning. And so this book was going to be something different. This is a book that was going to be a series of interviews. And so I thought it would be much simpler than the previous book. I thought the process for this book would go something like this. Like, I would conduct the interviews on Skype, and then I would record the audio files, and then I would get them transcribed. I use a service called Rev that was pretty inexpensive. It charges by the minute, and I could upload these audio files, and then actually within a number of hours, I would get a written Microsoft Word document back. And then I thought I would have a book, and it would be as easy as that. But actually what happened was that I learned that the editing process is so important, because once you get a bunch of these transcripts back, what you get are just a word-by-word record of what was said in conversation, which actually doesn't make for a very interesting a reading. And so I had to spend a lot of time editing all of these transcripts, making them consistent, making sure that they accurately reflected what was said in conversation. I really had to put on a writer's hat or an editor's hat to really get a good end product. And what happened afterwards is that I put this book out, and I actually learned a lot myself about these careers that these designers had put together. It was really a really eye-opening experience to hear the stories of these people who had all started out, with some vague interest in what design was, and through a series of trials and tribulations had managed to put together really interesting, really successful careers. And so I thought I would share some of that with you here. Okay, so here are a few lessons that I learned. The first one is the straight path is rare. And this is a little bit of a cliche because everybody knows careers have very organic paths. But one of the interesting things that I learned is that even though a lot of these careers look like they're very predetermined, and they look like the people who have had these successes have really set out with a very clear goal in mind and actually achieve that goal with determination and focus, what really happens is that they encounter a series of unexpected opportunities and really capitalize on those opportunities. This is a terrific quote from Erica Hall, who co-founded a company called Mule, and she said that she loves to look back at the things that she tried that totally didn't work out. Things go horribly, but somewhere down the line, that thing that went horribly wrong is going to totally help you do something really fantastic. She really believes that success is just the latest iteration in a series of failures. Here's another insight. Self-taught skills can matter as much as formal education. And actually, to some extent, what we learn or what we study in design programs is really a factor of how capable we are of teaching ourselves. I'm going to talk a little bit about education later, but this is a great quote that I'd like to share from a designer named Alex Cornell. He co-founded a company called FireSpotter, which is part of Google, and then he went on to Facebook. And he didn't start out as a designer. He actually didn't know what design was. And he said his path was that he would always look at design. He would really consume design, and he thought that's one of the most helpful things for me. At a certain point, if you look at enough good design over and over again, you can't help but try to consciously or even subconsciously replicate what you see. So in order to obtain those skills as a designer, he would actually study design and try to recreate it, and basically teach himself the thought process that the designer that he was emulating would go through in order to produce that end result. Self-doubt is a frequent companion. So this is actually an insight that really made a lot of sense to me because, throughout my career, I feel like I've been very lucky, and I often feel like I'm just skating by, or I'm just managing to fool enough people to get to the position that I got to. And I heard something really interesting from Dan Cederholm. So if you guys are familiar with the site Dribbble, Dan is the co-founder of Dribbble, and he had an illustrious career before joining Dribbble even. But Dan says, I always felt like a fraud. He said, that's kind of a cliche, but it's true. I think that's also healthy in that it helps keep you on your toes, and it keeps you wanting to learn more. So this is Dan Cederholm. He's convened one of the most robust, vibrant, the most active communities in the design world ever, right? He's at the center of this really, really terrific phenomenon, and even he feels that he's maybe not qualified to be there sometimes, and he always keeps that idea close to him, and he actually uses it to keep him propelling forward, to work a little bit harder. So this is another great insight. At some point, you really have to take a leap of faith. So I talked to a lot of these folks who, they started out in their careers and they were able to achieve some level of success, and they could have kept coasting on that success, but they ultimately decided that it wasn't enough, or it wasn't close enough to what they really wanted to do, and so they felt like they really had to take a leap of faith and to gamble and try to get to another level, to get closer to what they wanted really wanted to do. So this is a quote from Agnieszka Gasparska. She's a co-founder of a company called Kiss Me I'm Polish in New York City. And she started out in her career at a very, very hot, very, very in-demand studio in New York called Funny Garbage. And she worked there for 5 years, and then she said, there came a point when I felt like I had grown as much as I could grow in that particular environment. It was a 5-year job that I started straight out of school, so I just said, okay, what else is there? And what she did is she quit that job, not knowing what was going to come next, and she started doing some independent projects, freelancing, collaborating with people that she knew that she liked. And eventually that turned her into an opportunity to create her own studio. And she's been running this studio for a number of years now, and they do really fantastic work. And then there's this insight. As much as we all love doing design, one of the things that I heard over and over again is there's really no getting around becoming a business person to some extent. This is a quote from Cemre Gungor, who co-founded a company called Branch, and they were acquired by Facebook, and he works at Facebook now. He says, the toughest thing about being a designer co-founder is not managing a team or your relations with the other co-founders, but it's that tension between being a maker and a business person. And for people like me who got into design because we love to sit in front of a screen and make those decisions about typography and layout and scale, this has always been an idea at the back of my head. It's the idea that given the choice, I would rather spend my time creating designs, but you always have to keep in mind that in order to get the opportunities to do the work that you want to do, you have to embrace the business side of design. You have to really get out there and work with the other disciplines, with sales, with engineering, with product management, and really create the conditions that are necessary in order to do the work that you really want to do. So having conducted all these interviews, I took a step back and tried to get a sense of the bigger picture. And I asked the question, before they achieved their success, like, where did they come from? And throughout my career, I've been doing design, since the 1990s. And one of the things I heard really often about digital design is that digital designers come from everywhere. And I've always taken that as a truism, because the work we do is usually so new. It's very often without any kind of precedent. It always requires new skills. And after doing all these interviews, one of the things that I saw was that it's not necessarily true that designers come from everywhere. What I found is that at first glance, looking at these 14 people, you might think that the majority of them don't have design backgrounds, right? They come from psychology backgrounds, computer science, film, architecture, or even philosophy. But what happens is, when you take a closer look, is that a number of them are either come from design backgrounds, or they have training in what you might think of as disciplines that are adjacent to design, meaning they they're disciplines that sooner or later they would have encountered design, they would have needed to work with designers, or they would have needed to understand the principles of design. And more than that, if you think about who actually went back for secondary degrees to get more training in design, and you look at the picture now, and there's a lot of folks here who have some kind of design schooling, some kind of background in design. So what I learned is that successful designers can come from any schooling, but design schooling is really the most common way to build a really successful career in design. I also really learned that the thing that really links all of these people that I interview, that really binds them together, is that they're all very adaptable. They've had very adaptable attitudes towards their work, and they're all very curious. The reason that this works is that these traits are really, really invaluable when we work in tech, because tech is ever-changing, and it actually changes in roughly 5 to 7 year cycles. There's always some new platform that you have to come to grips with, that you have to master, and then you have to learn what's going to work in that new idiom. And so having these skills is really, really invaluable for that. And if you look at the way design has changed over the past couple of decades, it's really, really, really goes to how important it is to be adaptable and to be curious. So when I started out in design, single users who would determine a specific piece of a project, and then it might all come together at the end. And the work that we would create as designers in technology, it was fairly static. They were mock-ups, they were comps. But over time, as design became more and more important, what would happen is that the workflows got much more collaborative as we started working with other parts of the business, engineering, product management. It became more and more important to think about workflows through the lens of a team. Similarly, the work that we did became more and more multidimensional, more and more dynamic. We would have to create responsive designs. We'd have to create prototypes that really were animated and would respond to user input. So we went from saying, I design how it looks, to saying, we together are going to design how it works. And that's a really, really fundamental kind of transformation that we've all been through. And it's really only going to continue and get more complex. So if you think about the other new technologies that we're dealing with, machine learning, AR, VR, voice in particular, this is a kind of design that doesn't use typography, doesn't think about layout, doesn't think about composition. It's really about direct input and output from the system. And yet, it's also completely about user experience. It's also about making the user feel welcome and make the experience feel really, really smooth for them. And so, design is going to continue to evolve and continue to change. And this can be really frightening when you're thinking about your career arc. You really have to prepare yourself for these periodic changes. And so this is a great quote from the book from a woman named Karen McGrain. She co-founded a company called Bond Art and Science. When I interviewed her, she said, I've got a good 15, almost 20 years under my belt, and I've easily got another 15 to 20 years in me. I've seen lots of change happen, and I feel very comfortable that some new change will roll along and that I'll be able to adapt to it if I want to. And then she goes on to say, and that's a great feeling. It actually lends a significant amount of confidence to my work to be able to look back on challenges that I've had, rough spots in my career, and say, I got through that, and I'll get through the next one too. And that was a really, I think, important lesson for me personally, in the middle of my career. Just understanding that the act of adapting and getting through these different changes is a really valuable skill that everybody has to learn when they start out, and not everybody gets it right away. So if you've been through one or two of these changes, you should really feel good about having mastered those skills. So back to this idea of writing about design. One of the things that I've come to understand over the years is that the bar for what gets written about design is fairly low. And the reason for that is that most of what gets written out there about design, it's written by other designers. It's written by people like you and me. And that's not inherently bad. It's actually really good that we have this community that's willing to share, that really wants to contribute to like a pooled knowledge base and help everybody move along. But it's not good enough. It's not good enough just to rely on us writing for ourselves. Because back to the idea that I talked about earlier, it's like the ultimate goal of what we do should be to help everybody else understand design better. That's going to make our lives better. So just to go back in time a little bit, before the advent of the internet and the digital era that we know now, when design was at its peak during the analog age, we had all these great publications, Emigre, ID, Critique. This was a magazine that its whole purpose was to talk about design in a really deep, penetrating fashion. And designers would read this stuff. They would consume these magazines and discuss the ideas. But now all of these are gone, right? Except for I Magazine, which is still going strong out of the UK. For the most part, this whole generation of publications devoted to thinking about design in this way, they've all left us. And what we have now is Medium. For better or for worse, this is where we've decided that our ideas about design, what we want to learn about design, this is where it should go. Now, there are a lot of great things about Medium, but if you look closely at what bubbles up on Medium, what gets really popular, it's not really terrific writing about design. A lot of it is very tactical, like articles about how you can sort of master some technique or master this next phase in your job or your career, or how you can pull off like specific tricks in certain kinds of technology. Or they're really superficial kind of surveys of what's trendy there. So almost encouraging everybody to copy what's going on out there rather than looking really deeply at what it means to do this kind of work. And then there are articles that are just like really about people, with an axe to grind, people who are just ranting or just trying to stir up trouble out there and not really taking a sober look at what's happening in the world. And if anybody reads designer news, this is a leaderboard of what we as a community think is interesting. So every day, the most popular, the trending articles float to the top. And most of this stuff is not really thoughtful writing. Most of this stuff ultimately boils down to people selling each other on things. You're either selling products to one another or selling a technique that you've used at your company, usually in order to gain some notoriety for your company or maybe to fill a position that you're hiring. It's really about marketing to one another, and it's not really about looking really deeply at the work that we do and asking why we do it. So it's just a fact that, as an industry, we really lack knowledgeable professions. We lack a class of people whose job it is to think critically about design, who get paid to examine the work that we do and push us forward. Now, when I bring up this idea, a lot of people think that it's unrealistic, but it's actually what happens in other art forms. So if you think about architecture, for instance. In architecture, you have these really well-respected critics. This is Michael Kimmelman. He is the architecture columnist at the New York Times. He nearly won a Pulitzer Prize for his writing about design. It's about a different kind of design, but it's about design, and he writes for a general audience of people who aren't architects, but they're all come to his work to help them understand architecture and what it means in their lives. I'm not sure if you're familiar with this next couple. This is Siskel and Ebert. This is an old picture. That's why they're dressed so funny. They're movie critics, so they were movie critics. They both passed away, but for a long time they had a TV show. Every week they would review the current movies, but not just to review whether they were good enough to buy a ticket to. They actually talked in a very like easy to understand way about the ideas behind cinema, about the ideas behind movie making and what movie makers do. And that helped everybody become more aware of the importance of film, of the importance of the craft. Now, if you think about what would happen if these guys were practicing film producers or screenwriters, or if they were actually directors. Roger Ebert wrote one screenplay, but for the vast majority of his career, he was just a critic. Or even you think about Michael Kimmelman. if while he was writing his column, he was also one of those architects that has projects going in 5 cities all over the world all at once, you'd come to one of 2 conclusions. You'd decide, okay, either this person or these people, they're either not very serious critics, or you would decide this is not a very serious art form, right? And that's basically the situation that we have today, right? We have people who are writing about design at the same time as they practice it. People like me. And I'll admit, like, when you write about the art form that you practice, that you make money from, it's an inherent conflict of interest. Because you're always thinking about, okay, like, is this going to get, the people that I work with mad, or a client that I want to win? Or is that going to offend them? Is my boss going to get upset? My boss is actually here, so I'm very careful about this. You can't write freely, and actually independence is really what's essential for worthwhile writing and criticism. So I think it's worth taking a moment here to ask, like, why is it important to have good design writing, right? And there's a long list of really good reasons for this, but I'm only going to talk about one now. And that reason is, it's because we've essentially asked for it to be important. By asking for design to be important, by making this argument over and over again that design deserves to be part of the conversation in business, in culture, in society, by saying this over and over again that we deserve a seat at the table, we have also effectively said that we need to be taken seriously and that we want our work to be looked at in a really rigorous, careful, thoughtful manner. And yet we haven't done that. We haven't really created the conditions for really thoughtful thinking and writing about design. So what we do today is we talk a lot about, like, how designers contribute when something is successful. We're very, very open about saying we participated in that success, we played a big part in that success. But when something fails, like, design is conspicuously quiet. So I'm going to give you a few examples of this. The first one is Twitter. So this is the story of Twitter. Like, it IPO'd at stratospheric heights and then spent the next several years progressively losing value. And along the way, the company spent a lot of money on hiring designers, on producing more design than ever. And with all these examples, I'm not saying that there's a correlation between what the design that was done and the end result. What I'm saying is you really need to ask yourself, with something as important as Twitter, it's become actually a geopolitically important product. It's really worth asking, what is design's role in that? Maybe it's all good, or maybe it's not all good. Same with Facebook. With Facebook, you have this problem where everybody on Facebook sees just what they want to see, and that's created really, really significant downstream effects that's affected our society. But when we think about the problem with Facebook, we think about that user experience problem, we tend to talk about it in technical terms. This is an article in the New York Times where they literally refer to that problem as a bug, as if it was something in the algorithm that was wrong, and it has nothing to do with the design, with the presentation, with the user experience. This is a really painful example for me, because not just because I voted for Hillary Clinton, but because a very good friend of mine, Jennifer Kinnan, was the creative director for Hillary for America, and I was so proud of her team. They did an amazing, amazing job. And we know much more now than we did a year ago about what happened here in terms of can we go back, please? Russian interference and so forth. But we also never really asked the question, like, did this stuff work? Did the design that the campaign generate, did that work for the electorate? Did they actually help her message or not? And again, I don't know if the answer is yes or no, but I do know that in 2008, when Barack Obama won his campaign, there was so much emphasis put on that beautiful Obama logo that was designed, and all the really beautiful user experience on their websites, and all the careful design thinking that was invested into that campaign. So it just doesn't seem really honest to then just completely excuse design from this really kind of catastrophic outcome. And here's a more concrete example. So, Yahoo has been plagued with security and privacy. And actually, security and privacy is going to be a huge part of every designer's job in the next decade. You really have to think about the implications of what we do in terms of the user's well-being. So 1 billion user accounts were compromised. And so just yesterday, I decided to see how well Yahoo had responded to that. So I tried to change my password. This is the actual password screen. And I typed in a very, very dumb password, just literally password, which people still do. And quite rightly, Twitter gave me a warning that said it's too easy and that I should try making it longer and harder. So I said, okay, what if I make it just a little bit harder? So I typed in password 1234, and it said, okay, you're good to go, this is barely any more secure than what happened previously. So this is a case where, it's a user experience team didn't have like a critical, deep conversation with the engineers about what was in the user's best interest here. And it continues to be a problem. So just to recap this part of it, we've really, for several decades now, we've been waging a campaign to argue for our credibility as a profession. But really to get to that next stage, if we really want to be taken seriously as a craft and as professionals, we really just have to embrace better rigor and accountability. So how do we do this? All right, so these are some very simple guidelines about how to think critically about what you read, what you consume about design. There's basically 4 really simple questions that you should ask yourself. First, who wrote it? What is it saying? How is it being said? And how effective is it for you? So spend a little bit of time on each one. So when you ask who wrote something, you're really trying to understand what are the credentials of the person who wrote this. Are there any relationships that are either disclosed or undisclosed? You're basically trying to figure out if there's a conflict of interest there. And with design writing, there's almost always a conflict of interest these days, as I mentioned earlier. It's really important to ask, what does the writer stand to gain from this? And the fact that the writer has something to gain from it doesn't mean that it's automatically bad. It just means that it's important for us to understand those motivations. So what is it saying? You really want to understand what is the central message, because designers often wrap up that central message in a lot of other talk about technique and about context and about competition and so forth. You really want to understand what is really trying to be said there and how is it being said. What verifiable independent sources does the designer offer? One thing that happens a lot is that a designer will write about a personal experience having just finished a project, but it will write about it in such a way that it's meant to imply that everybody can learn from this experience equally. And that's just not the case. A lot of times, the experiences that we have on projects or designing things, they're valid, but they're only necessarily valid in that one instance. You really have to think about whether they apply to a lot of other instances. We also want to ask, how effective is it? Did it challenge your assumptions? Did you learn something new from it? And did you find it valuable even if you didn't agree with it? And that's maybe one of the most important questions. It's you don't have to agree with everything that you read. Sometimes you get just as much from things that you don't agree with as you do from something that you feel really, really passionately an advocate of. Okay, so I'm going to close now with just this one question. When I talk about this concept of critical thinking in design, one of the things I hear from a lot of designers is, well, isn't this just a waste of time? Shouldn't designers who want to contribute to the craft, shouldn't they spend their time just making a really good design, making something good and lead by example? And there's a great argument for that. And I think it's totally valid to not be a writer and to really try to focus on doing the best you can with your craft in order to help push everybody forward. But I will say that thoughtful writing and criticism, they're actually inherently optimistic endeavors because they imagine a better world for all of us, and they help us try to understand how to get there. So that's what I have for today. Thank you for bearing with my clicker. Thanks a lot.